Let's continue on the Robbins article on the capability approach. And Robbins continue by mentioning uh, specific advantages of the capability approach. Well, the main point of the capability approach is, of course, we are aiming to measure basically the capability of the people, which doesn't necessarily need to be mathematical measurement. In certain communities, it can very well be uh, without numbers. And even if it is with numbers, if we try to make numerical uh, basically, uh, if we manage to overcome the challenges, uh, basically, this approach has certain advantages. Again, if we manage to overcome its challenges. First, it is focusing on individual. Resources are, in many cases, we can divide the resources all the way to the households. However, there we need to stop. We don't see how the resources are distributed within the households, between wife, husband, children, and other family members, potential family members. But uh, people's ability to meet their needs are defined individually. So each individual in the family now can be focused on separately with this approach. Again, this allows us to go to a smaller dimension than the previous than the resource-based approach allows us to go. Secondly, well-being is affected by production done by non-market production spheres, also volunteering, household production are examples of that. Well, or community type of work, for example. And in certain places, that type of work might be very important. Of course, when we look to the well-being of the people, then of course we also measure indirectly the effect of those non-market resources, non-market production on the people at the same time. The third thing is it accounts for the diversity. The very famous thing for the resource-based approaches, you might try to guess what resources are necessary for example, lift people from the poverty. But different people might have different needs, basically. And for certain people, there might be more resources necessary to meet those needs. For example, in a country where public transportation is developed, the need of transportation is met with much less resources than in a country or in a place where public transportation is not developed and everyone needs to have his or her own car, for example. So, since we are focusing not on the resources but whether or not the needs are met, this diversity factor is also accounted in case of capability approach. Uh, well, for example, if you think about the car issue, if the two people have same income, but one of them is living in a place where public transportation is not met, one of the person with the same amount of income won't be able to meet, for example, might not be able to have sufficient income to have a car to meet his transportation needs. The other one might also not have enough resources to have a car, but since public transportation is developed and he is able to use it, he might his income might be sufficient to meet his need, basically. The fourth thing is actually the disadvantage of the capability approach. It has an unspecified character. So, as we have mentioned, when we can define the needs, and that when we are able to find a way to measure basically the ability to meet those needs. Now, this method might work, but what are the needs? To what extent, at what point we can basically decide the need is met? These are not that clear, at least, and this unspecified character might basically make people use this approach for their and manipulate it for their own purposes, basically. At least this approach is well, relatively more. It's more possible to pull this approach to the direction people want it to go. There's a possibility for this approach to be used for that purposes. I mean, verify the results people want to verify. But this unspecified character, if it is done, if a proper research is used, use this approach, might also be kind of an advantage according to Robbins. Robbins think that actually, capability approach, here you might think about the softness of the feminist economics, as we have discussed in the previous lecture. This capability approach allows us to be flexible, to be defined and redefined for different societies, for different levels of societies, for different places basically, and for different purposes we use this approach. For example, if we use for academic research, we might define our capabilities and ways to measure our capabilities in a certain way that allows our purpose. I mean, for example, rough understanding whether women or men are equal or not equal. But if we want to use capability approach for more policy purposes, then we might want maybe measure the capabilities to meet needs in a numerical way. In that case, I mean, the definitions might be more clear and might at least lead to some variable that is measurable, basically. So according to Robbins, actually, the way to measure capability approach should be vague, and it should be said in a vague way, and different, let's say, papers or different projects that have different aims should be able to adapt capability approach in the way they need to adapt it, basically. So here, Robbins discussed the case of the lists, basically, and this issue is also discussed by the Nussbaum. Actually, I will directly go to Nussbaum after this because the discussion of the list is relevant there. Nussbaum pretty much thinks that in order to be able to measure how societies are doing, or a single society is doing throughout different times, it is necessary to make capability approach more solid approach with some solid indicators. So there should be some lists which should be agreed on at least some universal academic circles, which could be criticized and which could be modified in time, of course. But Robbins doesn't think that way. Robbins thinks the list should not be universal. And for example, if it is used for political purposes, he also thinks that the list should be created democratically. Maybe people should be asked create the list. But whenever it is created, it should be created with a methodology that is clear and consistent. So how we create the list, why we take certain things as are certain needs to the list and certain needs not to the lists. Why we choose certain variables, if we choose variables that actually measure the capability to meet that link. All of those things should be clear. Within the project itself, the methodology should be clearly set. There should be nothing vague on the methodology. And that's the way we deal with this unspecified character in project by project. Not universally, but project by project we deal with it. And Robbins has created an example of the list. This is the list basically. Life and physical health, mental well-being, bodily integrity, safety, social interactions, political empowerment, education and knowledge, domestic work, paid work, shelter, mobility, leisure, time autonomy, respect, religion. The ones that are for each one here, Robbins briefly discuss both what they mean and basically and why they should be taken to the list, and basically whether or not women or men are ahead for that particular need. I mean, in terms of their ability to meet that need. Well, in some cases, for example, for the paid work, the discussion might be there's a discussion on what it means, and in some cases, I mean, he discusses the capabilities of people to meet the paid work in two different sense. I mean, in two different ways it can define as a need. Well, one way is, for example, the paid work should not be that heavy and that, it should be give proper wage maybe. The other one might be access to the paid work basically. So paid work might be both as a burden, and people should be able to, not be restricted by that burden, but they might also want, it should also be something people might want to have. I mean, be able to do basically. In that case, it's something people want to do. So access to the paid work might be, in that sense, also something important. The ones that are underlined are the ones that are, at least according to some definitions, men are better off. For example, men are worse off, or at least, I mean, it is discussable whether women or men are better or worse off. In all others that are not in the ones for the ones that are not underlined, basically, women are clearly worse off according to definitions made by Robbins. For example, there are more homeless men, which means men are less able to meet capabilities. Meet their need of getting a shelter. Life and physical health, or bodily integrity or safety, for example. Men are physically attacked more, but women are sexually attacked more. So here, in some sense, men are worse off. In some sense, women are worse off, basically. And you can look to each particular need specifically, and I will encourage you to do that. I mean, it's interesting list and interesting discussion. There is interesting discussion under each need. So, we will continue in the next part.